Hello and welcome to the third video for Unit 5. This video will be focusing on explaining and classifying psychological disorders. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following questions. How are behaviors and mental processes identified as psychological disorders, and what factors contribute to their classification and diagnosis? How do different psychological perspectives, for example, behavioral, psychodynamic, cognitive, biological, explain the causes and development of psychological disorders, and how do interaction models such as the biopsychosocial model and the diathesis stress model explain the complexity of psychological disorders. So when we talk about psychological disorders, we're referring to patterns of thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that cause significant distress, dysfunction, deviance, or danger. A psychological disorder is typically defined as a condition that affects a person's cognition, emotions, or behavior in a way that interferes with their daily life. When we are determining if a behavior is abnormal or not, so if it could be classified as something that would lead to a diagnosis as a psychological disorder, we need to look at the 4 Ds of behavior. The first is danger. If a behavior that someone is participating in is risky or could harm themselves or others, this would be classified as a dangerous, abnormal behavior. The next is deviance. If the behavior or thoughts differ significantly from the social norms of that person's group, for example, extreme paranoia or hallucinations, then we could consider that behavior abnormal. The third is distress. If the behavior causes emotional suffering, such as severe anxiety or depression, we can consider that abnormal. And finally, dysfunction. When the disorder or behavior disrupts daily life, making it hard to work, maintain relationships, or take care of yourself, that would be classified as abnormal behavior. When we are looking at psychological disorders, we also need to define things as maladaptive. Maladaptive means incorrect or dysfunctional. So maladaptive thoughts are negative or distorted ways of thinking that prevent us from coping effectively with life's challenges. They often lead to anxiety, depression, or low self-esteem. For example, imagine a student who fails one test and immediately thinks, I'm a total failure. I'll never be good at anything. This kind of thinking is extreme, and it's unhelpful because one test doesn't define a person's abilities. Instead, a healthier approach would be, I didn't do well this time, but I can study next time and improve. Maladaptive behaviors are actions people take to deal with stress or emotions, but instead of helping, they make things worse in the long run. For example, let's say someone is feeling overwhelmed at school. Instead of addressing their workload, they procrastinate, avoid responsibilities, or engage in unhealthy habits like excessive gaming, overeating, or substance abuse. While these behaviors might provide temporary relief for the person feeling overwhelmed, they don't solve the root of the problem and can create even more stress. And finally, maladaptive relationships. These are relationships that are unhealthy, unbalanced, or even harmful. They often involve poor communication, control, manipulation, or a lack of mutual respect. For instance, if one friend constantly puts down the other and makes them feel unworthy, yet the person stays in the friendship because they fear being alone, that's an example of a maladaptive relationship. Over time, these relationships can lower self-esteem and cause emotional distress. Throughout history, psychological disorders have been misunderstood. In ancient times, they were often thought to be caused by evil spirits or supernatural forces, leading to cruel treatments like exorcisms or isolation. Later, during the 1800s, reformers like Philippe Pinel and Dorothea Dix advocated for humane treatment, recognizing that mental illness is a medical condition, not a moral failing. Today, psychologists use the biopsychosocial model, which considers biological, psychological, and social factors in understanding and treating disorders. Instead of punishment or confinement, modern treatment focuses on therapy, medication, and support systems to help individuals lead fulfilling lives. In order to properly diagnose and treat psychological disorders, mental health professionals use classification systems to ensure consistency and accuracy. The two major organizations that are responsible for these systems are the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, and the World Health Organization, WHO. The American Psychiatric Association publishes the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, which is the primary guide used by mental health professionals in the United States. The DSM-5 categorizes mental disorders based on specific symptoms, helping psychologists and psychiatrists diagnose conditions like anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and schizophrenia. The DSM-5 is regularly updated to reflect new research and understanding. It not only lists disorders, but also includes criteria for diagnosis, severity levels, and risk factors. While the DSM-5 is widely used in the US, the World Health Organization developed the International Classification of Diseases, ICD, which includes a section on mental and behavioral disorders called the ICD-11. This system is used worldwide to help standardize diagnoses across different countries and cultures. Classifying psychological disorders helps professionals because accurately diagnose and treat mental health conditions. It standardizes diagnostic criteria across different psychologists, doctors, and countries. It helps conduct research to improve mental health treatments and policies, and it reduces stigma by defining disorders as medical conditions rather than personal failings. While we do want to diagnose and classify psychological disorders, we also have to understand why those disorders are appearing. And we can look at these reasons from all of the different perspectives in psychology. As you can see in this table, psychologists have different ways of understanding mental health issues. The psychodynamic perspective is based on Freud's theories, and it suggests that psychological disorders stem from unresolved childhood conflicts and unconscious thoughts. For example, someone with anxiety might have repressed childhood trauma influencing their current behavior. The humanistic perspective is focusing on personal growth and self-fulfillment. It argues that mental health struggles come from a lack of social support and the inability to reach one's full potential. In other words, when people feel disconnected or unable to grow, they may develop psychological issues. The behavioral perspective sees mental disorders as learned behaviors. If someone repeatedly experiences negative reinforcement, they may develop maladaptive learned associations. For example, if a child receives attention only when they panic, they might unconsciously learn that anxiety brings attention. Next is the cognitive approach. This perspective focuses on thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes. It suggests that disorders stem from maladaptive thinking patterns. For instance, someone with depression might constantly think, "I'm worthless," which worsens their condition. Next is the biological perspective. According to this view, psychological disorders have a genetic or physiological basis. Conditions like schizophrenia, for example, are often linked to brain chemistry and inherited traits. Next is the evolutionary perspective. This perspective suggests that some disorders arise from behaviors that were once useful for survival but are now maladaptive. For instance, excessive anxiety might have helped early humans stay alert to danger, but today it can develop into an anxiety disorder. And finally, we have the social cultural perspective. This view highlights the role of society and culture in mental health. For example, someone experiencing extreme stress due to discrimination or poverty may develop psychological issues. Each of these perspectives provides a different lens to understand psychological disorders. In reality, mental health issues are often complex and may involve multiple factors from these perspectives, which is why we often go to models that include more than one of these perspectives. The first is the medical model. This one fits mainly with the biological perspective, and this is the idea that mental and emotional problems are like physical illnesses. They have a clear biological cause, such as a faulty gene or damaged brain cells. Because of this, people using the medical model will often say that psychological disorders can be treated or improved with specific medical treatments, like medication or therapy. However, I mentioned before that most of the time, psychologists are looking at a mental health disorder and taking in multiple factors that cause that disorder. And this can be explained through a number of different approaches. The first is the biopsychosocial model. This says that psychological disorders arise from a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. This model rejects the idea that mental disorders can be understood solely through one perspective, and it emphasizes the need to consider multiple dimensions of a person's life and health. The diathesis stress model suggests that psychological disorders develop due to a combination of predisposition and environmental stressors. A diathesis, or the predisposition, can be genetic, biological, or psychological, and it predisposes an individual to a disorder. But the disorder manifests only when significant stress triggers it. Finally, we have the eclectic approach. In psychology, this is a therapeutic strategy that combines elements from various psychological theories and techniques to address an individual's specific needs. So this is based on the therapy rather than the causes. Rather than adhering strictly to one school of thought when treating a disorder, an eclectic therapist integrates methods from different approaches, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, humanistic therapy, and others to tailor treatment to the unique circumstances of each individual case. When a person is diagnosed with a psychological disorder, that label can have both positive and negative consequences. The positive consequences are that a diagnosis helps people receive proper treatment, access to support, and understand their condition, leading to well-being improvement. The negative consequences, however, are that labels can also lead to stigma and discrimination. People might face judgment or be treated unfairly based on their diagnosis, even if they are capable and functional. A famous study was done by David Rosenhan in 1973. Rosenhan and his colleagues pretended to have hallucinations and got admitted to psychiatric hospitals. Once inside, they acted normally, but doctors continued to treat them as if they were mentally ill. This study reveals the dangers of misdiagnosis and labeling. Once someone has a psychiatric label, it can be hard to shake, even if they don't actually have the disorder. Psychology and the law intersect in many ways, particularly in issues like competency to stand trial, criminal responsibility, and involuntary commitment. One key point is that psychological treatment is confidential. This means that therapists cannot share a patient's information without consent, except in cases where the patient is a danger to themselves or others. This includes being asked to take the stand to testify against a patient. A common misunderstanding is the word insanity when it comes to law. In psychology, we don't diagnose someone as insane. That's actually a legal term used in court. The insanity defense means that someone was not mentally capable of understanding their actions at the time of a crime. However, this defense is rarely successful because it is very hard to prove. The psychological disorders are classified into major categories in the DSM-5. We will look at some of these categories throughout our time in this unit.